Is it a full-on youth movement rebuild for the New York Sirens? We'll talk about that and more on today's episode of the Women's Hockey Report.
This is the Women's Hockey Report presented by Locked On NHL. Your weekly look at the world of women's hockey. From the PWHL to the international stage, it's the Women's Hockey Report on the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello, women's hockey fans. Welcome to another episode of the Women's Hockey Report, brought to you by the Locked On NHL channel. We bring you women's hockey every Saturday. L Ayala here alongside Rachel Donner, and we are excited to continue our deep dive series. After today, we only have two more teams, the expansion teams, Rachel, to talk about. But first, we have to talk about the Sirens, well represented. I love it. I love to see it. Want to let folks know that today's episode of the Women's Hockey Report brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Now, Rachel, we're talking about the Sirens here, and I've been hearing a lot of Sirens here at the Amerigo Latam Cup, the Goal Sirens, which is why my voice is a little raspy here. But we're excited for another deep dive. We've had a few, one former and a current Siren that have joined us on the Women's Hockey Report. But we have to talk about this team. I think the on-ice production, what we saw in the last really two seasons, but we're going to talk about 24-25, has left more to be desired. And as I alluded to in the cold open, perhaps this is the first team to, in earnest, maybe try a rebuild here. And we'll talk about that through the draft picks in particular. So, Rachel, you've got the Sirens hat on. We know that you have once come across some Sirens family members in your own apartment complex.
Yes.
So let's talk about this team. How would you summarize season 2 for New York?
Yeah, it was the struggle for this team. And I think, there was a lot of expectations put on this team, especially with the addition of Sarah Fillier to the lineup. And there was just a lot of inconsistency with their play on several levels. I think just systematically from an offensive perspective, I think the goaltending was really inconsistent. As much as we loved Corrine Schroeder, right? She had some not great games, and the backups had some not great games as well. So I think there was just a lot of general inconsistency there. And one of the other striking things about this season for them is that they were so much better on the road than they were at home. They got 23 points on the road and only 14 on home ice. And when you're struggling on home ice, sometimes that makes it a little worse.
For sure. Yeah. They moved to Prudential Center, which is great for fans coming in from the tri-state area. And again, trying to make it home has been a little bit difficult, as you said, with that record. The inconsistencies have been huge here. And I think eventually, Rachel, you mentioned road record. I mentioned Prudential Center. I think at some point in time, we do want to talk about if this is the right location for this team. I mean, in the WNBA, there's all kinds of conversations about relocation and the league forcing the issue. This is a little bit different since it's only a single owner for all teams. They can move the team wherever they want. But, attendance, is that an issue? And is that a part of location? Which I think it definitely was for season 1. Is that a part of performance? I think that's definitely something to talk about with the Sirens down the road. Yeah, because it's glaring. That being said, we just finished season 2, so I don't know how critical we want to be. I think Toronto could be a similar situation. We've actually had comments on our YouTube channel about that, so something definitely to circle back to. But let's get back to on ice. Why didn't the Sirens make the playoffs? Well, I mean, the record, I think some other teams, it was a little bit more of a gray area. With New York, the inconsistencies, and again, they weren't able to quite honestly get enough wins to even make themselves a team that could jockey for position like we did see with the two teams in the finals, actually, in Minnesota and Ottawa.
Yeah, I think so. And I think, there was like some bright moments, I think, earlier in the season for sure. I think that we saw the potential of what they could be that they just couldn't keep up with as the season progressed. And I think, other teams got it together and the
Right.
Sirens just didn't.
Never
And I
did.
think, yeah, I really think that was the crux of it for them, is that other teams figured out ways to win and they just couldn't.
And so, do you think that that was more personnel? Was it more, and by that I mean the team roster, I should say, the players? Was that more front office and coaching staff personnel? Do you think it was a blend of both?
I think it was a blend of both. It is really interesting what the Sirens have chosen to do this off season on
Mhm.
both fronts, right? In terms
Mhm.
of how they handled expansion and, in the coaching side of things, Greg Fargo is returning as head coach, but they got rid of like the whole assistant coaching staff there and have brought in some new people. So I think that they are very aware that there were problems this past year. It's just been a very clear-cut decision about what the path forward is for them. It's just a matter of if it will work or not, and how patient, the organization is going to be in terms of allowing it to work.
Right. 100%. It wasn't all doom and gloom. You've already mentioned Sarah Fillier. We clocked it early. Rookie of the Year. Indeed
Yep.
does collect the hardware. And we'll get to some of the returners. But since we're talking about Fillier, let's talk about the season and the fact that they lock her in. Seems to be a key piece to what they're trying
Yeah.
to do moving forward.
Right. And if you're going with a youth movement rebuild, you want to keep that one player, right? That's going to be your central piece to this youth movement moving forward. And even though she'll technically be a returning player, she's still young, right? Relative to the league. And so I think that was key. Like if they lost a whole bunch of really great players, but they kept like the key piece for their team moving forward, and I think that was important.
And I mean, we now know what the Emily Clark deal is, but at the time of her re-upping, I mean, it was one of the more lucrative and substantial contracts that we've seen in the PWHL. Unfortunately, we don't have full disclosure on those things. We just have to rely on reports of what is the highest salary. But that is also, I think, to your point, that the New York Sirens have decided that Sarah Fillier is her.
Yep.
They're going to build around her. And, we'll talk about, and I think on this episode, but also throughout the season, Rachel, if the pieces that they brought in complement and suit building around Sarah Fillier. Like, what does that look like if that's
Yeah.
what you're doing? Because to your point, they offloaded some Olympians, past and likely future. And we'll talk about that as we continue on. So we know that Sarah Fillier, she was the first overall pick in 24. She was tied for the lead league in points. We've talked about that on other episodes. 13 goals, fourth in the PWHL, 16 assists, that 29 points in those 30 games. The 29 points, again, is where she was tied at the top of the table. This was a team that was active. They knew that they were going to get the number one pick once again because they were the first team officially mathematically eliminated. And we know we have the gold plan in the PWHL. But they also, Rachel, were able to rack up 9 total picks overall. And again, this all seems to be in service to a team wanting to do better than an 8-13 record. Those are just the wins, losses. Overtime wins, they had 4. They had 5 overtime losses here. The New York Sirens, not the only team under 500, but the only team under 48% win percentage here. So let's talk about who they lost either through the expansion draft or through free agency. And we talked about how there are some big names: Alex Carpenter, friend of the pod, Jesse Eldridge, Abby Roque. Those three stand out. We'll talk about goaltending as well. But I wanted to mention Carpy and of course Abby Roque. They also lose on the blue line Ella Shelton, which is huge.
Yeah.
Those to me sound like significant moves that were signaling at that entry draft that this team was moving in a different direction.
Right. Absolutely. And I think, they decided to go for this youth movement, and so they made trades, right? So Ella Shelton went to Toronto for the third overall pick in the first round. Again, youth movement deal there. They were willing to sacrifice on the blue line. Abby Roque got traded for Kristen O'Neill. So they did get one player back in the trades that they made uh, as part of what they were building toward for the future. But yeah, I think, overall, they lost a ton more on the forward side than the blue line, which is slightly different than some of the other teams we've been talking about in expansion, right? Who have had to like rebuild their entire blue line, or like the entire left side of the blue line was gone, right? Not with the Sirens. Like, they've kept the blue line essentially together, but the forwards got decimated.
Yeah, and for a team that at times had difficulty scoring, that's why again I think we're not in a hybrid rebuild. This is a full on rebuild. It
Yeah.
feels like, because now you bring in young talent, as we'll talk about later in the show, that still has to cut their teeth. That's the thing about having veterans in the PWHL, is that yes, the league is 2 years in, and there are players that have had multiple years, some of them because they had to defer for Olympics, multiple NCAA years, competitive NCAA years, some of them multiple Olympic or world championship appearances, in addition to finding their way professionally in the leagues that existed beforehand. That is not what New York is going to be able to lean on. And I wonder if that also goes to personnel as far as the coaching and even front office, because maybe that's not what New York wanted to deal with, is deal with players that are used to the the women's hockey that we saw prior to the PWHL. Is this maybe a move? And I don't know. I don't think we'll know right away, Rachel, but is this a move to have New York figure out a PWHL style as opposed to trying to integrate multiple different styles from other leagues or even international play? Again, we just don't know. But coming up on today's episode, let's talk a little bit more about who was lost. Again, we knew that they were going to lose some players with 2 expansion teams coming in, but they also got to retool specifically through the draft. Again, 9 picks overall. We'll talk about all of that, as well as, of course, who is returning for this Sirens squad. That's coming up on the Women's Hockey Report.
Have you ever decided at the last minute to head to a ball game with your friends or family? Maybe it's game day. You suddenly realize you need to be in the stands. That's exactly where Game Time comes in. It's the easiest way to grab those last minute tickets without the stress. With all the money you save, you can splurge on food or merch or bring more friends with you. Game Time makes buying tickets fast and simple. Prices on the app actually drop the closer you get to first pitch. They've got incredible last minute deals, clear seat views, and a lowest price guarantee that takes the worry out of buying. Game Time is the official ticketing partner of Locked On MLB, making it easy to browse the app for exciting upcoming games. My Phillies are at home this weekend versus the Nats, or you can come up to New York where I live and annoy the Mets fans when they're on the road there at City Field. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use the code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem with the code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download the Game Time app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed.
I see you couldn't help yourself with that New York Mets dig there. That's
Listen,
cold. That's
I,
cold,
I
Rachel.
am a Philly girl. I may be wearing a Sirens hat, but I am a Philly
Wow.
girl. So,
Wow, look at that. You
yeah.
think you know someone. Welcome back to the Women's Hockey Report. Erica L. Ayala and Rachel Donner taking jabs at me, the Mets fan here. Uh, but let's get back to the hockey, where we can agree that this Sirens team seems to be on a different path. And let's talk about Rachel. Do you think that this move towards the youth, the youths of it all, did we get any indication perhaps in who they decided to protect in the expansion draft? And were there any surprises when it came to who they decided to protect or who walked out the door?
Yeah, I think it was interesting to me. I mean, obviously, Sarah Fillier, like number one on my list, right? You have to protect her. I thought that the Micah Zandee-Hart protection. Now I understand she's team captain, and there's something to that. That maybe if you're going to keep things together and you're going to keep that blue line together, protecting her did make sense. But I did think that there were other options there, and maybe they just knew that these other players wanted to go elsewhere, and there was some kind of backroom stuff going on there. That is my supposition, that some of these players wanted to relocate on their own, and they were doing these players a solid, and that's why the protection list wound up the way it did in the end. But they did protect Ella Shelton and then traded her. So,
Yeah, which is interesting because, that trade came at the entry draft.
right.
And was that kind of a little gamesmanship on the part of New York? Was it that they protected Ella and then some of those conversations as they went forward, it just it got to the point where maybe Shelton wasn't going to return for the term that they wanted or play the role that they wanted? Did she ask for a relocation? Those are things that we just don't know, at least as of now. We haven't talked to Ella here for the Women's Hockey Report. But yes, I think that is interesting, which
Or
is
they just
why.
didn't want to lose her for nothing, right? So if
Right.
you have like a deal with Toronto in the works, like they did, right? Protect her so that they're not going to lose her in expansion for
Right.
nothing, and then be
100%.
able to make that deal.
Exactly. That's the gamesmanship I was alluding to. So thanks for, teasing that out, because you're right. That's a big name. They lost a lot of big names. But, do you want to lose them all for, again, effectively nothing because they are taken in the expansion draft or just go as, UFAs?
Exactly.
Yeah. So, okay. But so we see that other players that we haven't talked about yet, Gabby Rosenthal to PWHL Vancouver through the expansion draft. We also saw that Corrine Schroeder was an expansion signing by PWHL Seattle. We talked about the trades, Abby Roque. Then they lose Nora Toulouse, who goes back to Europe. Ella Shelton trade we talked about. We talked about Abby Levy on last week's episode because we were
Yeah.
focused on the Boston Fleet, but they lost two goaltenders
Yep.
between a free agency and expansion signings. So we were wondering, okay, what are you going to do? What's going on here? But we got some of those answers again when it came to what the return and the gains were from the the entry draft. So many drafts, Rachel. I get them confused. But what do you make of letting both Levy and Schroeder walk out the door? We have talked about the inconsistency in goaltending, so I can see it kind of both ways, Rachel. But how do you think this is going to play out when it comes to what New York is trying to do?
Yeah, it's interesting because they have gone with this youth movement across the board, right? It's not just skaters, it's the goaltenders as well. So Kaylee Osborne is the only returning goaltender from the organization. She's got 2 years left on her deal. She got 10 games in last season. So definitely in a backup role, but I think she picked up more games as the season progressed. She had a 916 save percentage. in those 10 games, a 2.22 goals against average. She did have 3 shootout losses, which was, maybe that's just not her forte, so to speak. But I think that's a little concerning. But they picked up 2 goaltenders in the draft. So that's obviously the direction that they've decided to go.
The youths. It's all about the youths, the fountain of youth here for the Sirens. We're going to get into those draft picks. We really want to break those down in the upcoming segment, as well as some news around the league. But let's talk about we have some returners as well. And you'll have a chance also, Rachel, to talk about how you see them fitting in. We talked about Fillier. Taylor Gerard is someone that they picked up in that Jill Saunier trade, but she was extended for 1 year. Kayla Vespa extended a year. Ella Hartier, who is a friend of the show, 2 years left on the deal. Peyton Levis as well. On the blue line, we talked about Zandee-Hart. Bourbonnais is another high-profile player. They were able to keep 1 year left on the contract. And you mentioned Osborne already. They also have brought in Savannah Norcross, or excuse me, that is a 1 year deal extension, right, for Norcross. Jinsey Rose is who they brought in on the blue line. So we'll get into again what this is going to look like, because it is overall young players. And I think the veteran talent or the experience that they have either in the PWHL, well, specifically PWHL players that either have pro experience elsewhere, but international experience. I'm curious to see how we think they're going to fit, because like a player like Rose dealt with an injury, so limited time on ice. But I even think, looking at what her performance has been in the time she was on the ice, Rachel, this might be a situation that is actually giving Jinsey Rose an opportunity on a young team to fill a leadership role and maybe play a different role than she was on her former team.
Yeah, and my understanding is that she wanted to come to New York for personal reasons. And so that was like the primary motivation for her signing in New York. But you're right, there is an on-ice opportunity here as well. And I think that, she could be like a good addition to this team. We'll just have to see, with the blue line being the way it is, and with all the returning players, like where exactly she's going to fit.
Mm-hmm. And we're going to do that coming up, as well as, again, go through the draft class, which was a large class because of the trades that they were able to make. We will get into that coming up here on the Women's Hockey Report. August 26th is officially FanDuel Futures Day, a brand new holiday for football fans who live for bold predictions and preseason hunches. For just 24 hours, that's right, for 24 hours, FanDuel is giving you deals on NFL season predictions. So whether you're calling your MVP, eyeing a long shot division winner, or ready to crown your Super Bowl champion before week 1 even kicks off, this is your moment. Visit the FanDuel app today and start planning your futures bets now, because Futures Day is one day and one day only. FanDuel, play your game. Listen, Rachel, I love futures bets. I love talking about them on the Locked on Kraken podcast. So I hope they find the holiday, not just for football, but maybe for some hockey as well. But we move on here, because the future of the New York Sirens, we keep talking about it, is really to find talent coming into the league. True rookies making their pro debuts, Rachel. And that comes in a big way through, of course, the entry draft. So 9 picks overall. They had the first pick overall once again. So back-to-back number 1 picks. Who's joining Sarah Fillier in the first overall pick club for New York?
So because of the Ella Shelton trade, they picked up the 3rd overall pick as well. So they had the 1st overall and the 3rd overall pick in the draft, which is huge. If you're having a youth movement, like that's what you got to do, right? You got to get something big in return, and they did. So they used, interestingly, the first overall pick on Kristina Kaltenkova, who is a phenomenal player, but maybe not projected as the first overall pick in the draft. And a clue to that pick was that she was coached by Greg Fargo at Colgate, right? And so there was a familiarity there. And I think she's great. 26 goals, 22 assists for Colgate last season. So it was 48 points in 37 games. Like, excellent player. Is she a first overall pick? I think you could maybe question that, but I think she would have been fine at the third overall pick. And they got the right two players, just maybe not in the correct order here, right? So with the third overall pick, they got Casey O'Brien from the University of Wisconsin. And so that was like the extra pick that they got. She's a New York native, so it's a great story for her to come home and play here. 88 points in 41 games last season for Wisconsin on that championship team. So I think they're in really good shape. If you're building a youth movement, great ads from that first round.
Yeah. And, you make an interesting point because was the pick more to satisfy, again, something that we talked about on this episode, the familiarity and getting your coaching staff to have a roster that they know that they can make some magic with? Does it matter? I think people will have a difference of opinion here. Realistically, in what they're trying to do, no. As far as I know, Rachel, I haven't read the CBA in a little while, but I don't recall there being specific bonus tiers or even pay tiers for number one picks or even first compared to other picks. So this financially wouldn't have impacted either player in theory, right? So like you said, got the right two players, and maybe you wonder, was there something even still on draft day that they were cooking up, trying to figure out, would O'Brien want to come to New York? I mean, it's always so interesting to me. These drafts are set up as if the players are going to go where they go. I think we have worked in sports long enough to know, Rachel, that that's not always how it works. So again, just interesting here. But like you said, they got the right two picks, but that's not all they got. They had a second round pick, a third round pick. They had 1, 2, 3 fourth round picks. And that's really interesting. But second round pick, the 9th overall pick, Ann Cherkowski from Clarkson University. They go in the third round with McKenna Webster from The Ohio State University. And then let's talk about this trio of picks in the fourth round, Rachel, starting with Ross.
Right. So Dale Ross, a defender from St. Cloud State, she was on the second pairing at St. Cloud. I do want to mention that Ann Cherkowski, though, the second round pick, she's a top line winger on Clarkson. And so when you talk about like potentially like 3 top line forwards coming to your team, I think that is a boost to your offense, which is exactly what they needed to fill in. So that was good. And then they kind of waited until the later rounds to pick defenders because that's where they're full up. So that's where they get Dale Ross. They picked up Maddie Wheeler, who's a forward at Ohio State. She was on their third line this past season. And then in the depth picks, that's where they got their 2 goaltenders, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah, we'll talk about that in a minute. Just want to circle back. So O'Brien at 3rd overall, Wheeler 27th overall, and Shanahan 28th overall. Those are all by way of trades that New York made. Now, as you said, they get great depth coming out of the NCAA into pro hockey when it comes to forwards. They needed a scoring touch, and in theory, they'll get that. And they'll presumably work with these young stars to get them pro ready so that they can compete with some of the players even that have exited the New York Sirens. Oh, and players like Marie-Philippe Poulin that are just crushing it. Hillary Knight now in Seattle. That being said, Rachel, we've talked about inconsistency in goaltending for this squad. Is there concern that they don't have an outright superstar in net when you are going to compete night in, night out against the Emrance Mashmeyers and Renee Debienne, and even talking about a youth movement, the Gwyneth Phillips of the PWHL. Is that a concern for you?
I mean, I think it is to some degree, but I do think that Callie Shanahan has a lot of potential in this league. And sometimes you need a goaltender that's outstanding, that's going to steal you games. And sometimes you need a goaltender that's just good enough, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that given the other additions to this team and the fact that they are in a more declared, more outward rebuild, I think it gives the goaltenders of this team a little bit of wiggle room to grow their game and adjust to the pro game here. And looking at Kaylee Osborne, giving her a chance to maybe earn a starting job here and see what she can do as a starter. I'm not sure if Callie Shanahan will have an opportunity to win that starting job this first year, and maybe it's a good thing for her to be the backup as she learns her way into the pro game. But she's had a pretty tremendous career. She, I believe, was in the Hockey East All Tournament team. Really, really solid credentials there. So I think that part of this rebuild is going to be fascinating to watch.
Yeah, and I think it also instructs that it's not necessarily the pressure to win now. They want to take time, and perhaps will have the personnel. And this is a big question mark because we've questioned personnel for the New York Sirens before. But do they have the right personnel to develop these young players, especially in goal? Because we saw what Gwyneth Phillips has been able to do with an opportunity. We've talked about Erin Frankel, who on the international stage has been someone kind of knocking at the door, but has arrived proper now that the PWHL is here. And so is it I don't want to say diamond in the rough, but is this an opportunity for New York to maybe flex their development skills by taking goaltenders, to your point, later in the draft and prioritizing other things earlier?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's exactly what they did. And I think, it's certainly a choice and a very clear direction. I'm not suggesting it's a bad one. I'm just saying that they made a very clear plan, and that's what they decided to do with goaltending.
And we shall see how it all pans out. But we're getting to the point in our deep dive of the New York Sirens where it's time for you to, you already have your New York Sirens hat on, but we're going to say it's your New York
Wee
Sirens.
woo, wee woo.
We're going to say it's your New York Sirens. Wee woo. That's hilarious. It took me a minute. I was like, no bing bong, but wee woo. We're going to make that a thing. But now you get to play the GM role, which you've done for all teams, not just the Sirens here, but taking your best guess at, now that we know who's on the roster, we know who's departed. Rachel, how do you see this team lining up when it comes to their defensive pairs and their forward lines?
So on the forward side, I think it is going to be interesting at camp to see what develops in terms of where Christina Kaltenkova lines up in the lineup, because I think ideally, I would put her at wing for this first season, but she can play center. We know that. So I think it's, what they decide to do with Ann Cherkowski as well is going to help determine that. If they decide they want Kaltenkova as a center, maybe Cherkowski swings out to the wing, but I would put Cherkowski in as the third center here with Kristen O'Neill and Casey O'Brien as your first couple of line centers here, and put Kaltenkova on the wing, because I want that Sarah Fillier, Kristen O'Neill, Kaltenkova line. Like, I think that's a great top line for this team. And then if you have Casey O'Brien with, possibly like Peyton Levis on that line with her, maybe Taylor Gerard on the second line, but it could be Harcha as well. I think there's a lot of mix and match here. And when you're having a young team like this, I think these lines are going to change a lot over
Yeah.
the course of the season. I don't think anything's going to get locked in except for maybe a top line if they start firing on all cylinders. But I
Yeah.
think they have the flexibility to move people around.
Yeah, I like that. I'm very curious to see how Gerard is using. I've gone on
Mm-hmm.
record saying before they did use her on special teams on the penalty kill because she does have good size
Right.
relative to what we see in women's hockey. That being said, she has potential as a true power forward here, and I wish they would have used her on the power play as well in New York. Will that change now that there's different personnel? I guess we'll see. We shall see. Now, the blue line again is an area where you get more of we're assuming leadership, not just your captain, but again, some players that have a little more experience than what we're seeing up front.
Yeah, of course, Micah Zandee-Hart is going to be back on that top pairing for sure. I mean, I just don't see any other way around it since like 90% of their blue line is back from last season, which again, they struggled defensively. So I think there's going to have to be some systematic changes to how this team plays and work on their breakout, especially their board battles. They're going to have to start winning more of those. And, maybe that's where Jinsey Rose can help augment that because I think she'll probably slot in on that second pairing with Jamie Bourbonnais.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's kind of the way it's going to go. But I do think that they're going to have to improve their defense systematically. And I think the forwards they've picked up can play two-way games. And I think that'll help.
Yes. Not just two-way games, but my read on some of these players is that they can also skate downhill very
Yep.
effectively. I think that it's going to be a little bit of asking a lot, especially of your centers in that two-way game, but also having your wings absolutely fly up and down the ice. I think they are going to try to speed up the pace at which this
Yeah.
team plays.
And just wear other teams out. I think
Right.
if other teams are so gassed from skating so much that their shot quality goes down, maybe the goaltending doesn't matter as much, right?
Which is where we're going here next, because we've already alluded to it, but really some unproven at the pro level goaltenders here. And if we talk about that, defense wasn't their strong suit, it wasn't their ministry last year. Not much has really changed there. Could it be a systems change? We will see. That's not something that we can, really discuss right now. We'll have to see what happens after camp and of course once we start playing the games. But if this is a fast team, if this is a team that is playing well or better defensively to the point where they're winning more of those 50-50 pucks, then the point that you made earlier, Rachel, stands. Can you get a goaltender? Can you get a 1A, right, that plays well enough to just keep you in games?
Right, exactly. And I should mention they did also pick up Kaylee Doyle in the draft, and that'll be their third goaltender.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we'll see what happens there. I think we've gotten to this point already a few different ways, Rachel. But what's the overall prediction? What are we expecting here from the New York Sirens in their third season?
I think it's going to be a lot of adjusting. I think they are going to spend a lot of time in the early part of the season trying to iron things out and trying to figure out what combinations make the most sense. But I do think there's some opportunity here for them. And without a lot of pressure on this team, that's
Right,
sometimes you get some gold that comes out of it, right?
right.
And it's some unexpected success. And I think that's kind of what they're going to have to bank on, is that something is going to click with this team and this young combination of players that is maybe unexpected and that other teams are having trouble with figuring out.
Yeah, and they're going to get a chance to do it all together. So when you talk about really a rebuild and leaning into the youth movement, a part of that is that you're hoping that you can keep enough of these young players together throughout their pro career so that the chemistry
Mhm.
compounds year after year. And so getting Fillier there, knowing that that's someone that these players are going to get to play with, I do think if I had to guess, the blue line and probably goaltending. I don't know if that in 3 years, right, is necessarily the same lineup that we see. I think they're going to have to make some changes. They'll also bring in more young players in the draft, especially if this team is playing the way we think they are. They should have a great chance at a pretty high pick in the first round again. Are they going to make some moves? Are they going to hang on to some pieces to then, stock up on draft picks again? I think there's a lot of opportunity here. So as much as I'll put this on me. I've been very critical of what the front office has been doing. This to me, Rachel, is the first time where I'm like, okay, I think they have a plan. I think they're locked in. I think that they kind of went with the flow and realized that, again, whether it was the coaching staff, whether it's the players that they want to keep, that they didn't have the right mix and match for the style they're trying to play. Some of the players also maybe wanted to try something new, that there wasn't a style that fit their game. And I think, if I'm looking back in hindsight, that's probably what has made me uncomfortable about New York for these first 2 seasons, is that it just wasn't,
Right.
quite honestly, a team that was built in a way that was going to allow everyone to be as successful as they possibly could, kind of thrown together here in a way, so to speak. And this move, everything that we saw at the draft, these are bold moves. They're moving with intention, is my take
Yep.
on New York. Now, when will that pay dividends? That's the question that I'm going to want to ask to that front office. When are you expecting this to fall into place? Is it a 2-year plan? Is it a 3-5-year plan? What is the timeline to really turn things around, Rachel? And that's going to be key, because the one thing, it doesn't matter what sport you play, if you are claiming the New York market, there is an expectation that you are going to play a certain way when representing New York. And I think this team is in a better place now to do that and to really win over a fan base than they were in the last 2 seasons.
I agree. And I think the one word that keeps coming back to mind for me is adjustment. That
Mhm.
this team has to be able to adjust on the fly and work out all the kinks this upcoming season,
Right.
right? Like that's what this season is about for me, is making those adjustments to put them in the right position for the following season. And that's hard to hear as a fan sometimes, but
Right.
that's hockey right now.
That's hockey,
There's
baby. Oh, okay.
uh,
We're doing a little John Forsland, huh?
yeah, like there's teams in the NHL that are on like 5 to 7 year plans, and so yeah, I know.
Don't
So
don't do that to me. You've
it's
called me out
hard.
enough, Rachel.
Well, I was thinking about the Detroit Red Wings in my head when
Fair.
I
That's
said
fair.
that, but when all is said and done, I think that there's potential here for a two
Yes,
to 3 year plan here,
I agree.
which is I think reasonable
Right, right.
and I think good for the long-term success of the team.
I would agree. I would agree. All right, Pascal, I might be taking you from a hard boil to a simmer here, because, I had questions, I had doubts, and I'm a New Yorker, so I know what it's like. The New York. I like to think, Rachel, although who knows if this is true, but I like to think I'm more of a level-headed New Yorker. Maybe that's because I now work in sports, so I don't have the anxiety always that's attached with being a New York fan, a New York sports fan. We are very excitable people when it comes to sports because of our passion. So we'll see, Pascal. We might have to have you on the show to talk things over. But that's where things stand with this Sirens team. Before we head out, though, Rachel, a few news points, including someone that we talked about on last episode, officially locked in Boston.
Yeah, Haley Wynn, their top pick, who was the draft pick in between those two New York Sirens picks, the defender, she got a 3 year deal with the Fleet. So I think that is a really important contract for them to have signed long term.
100%. And then we talked a lot about personnel, and we have assistant coaches for Seattle. And Seattle and Vancouver will be the next 2 teams that we talk about in that order. And so, what can we say about the 2 assistant coaches for Seattle, including, someone who comes from a program that you, Rachel, know a little bit something about?
Yeah, so let's start with Christine Bumstead, because I love this hire by Seattle. And I think when we've talked really concerningly about coaching development in the PWHL. Like, she's a great example of coaching development because she has spent time in men's hockey, but she's also spent time in women's hockey. And so she understands the women's game, but has gotten supplemental support from the NHL in their female coaches program. And you love to see it. So she's coached in the WHL. She's coached in the university level in Canada. She coaches the Canada women's deaf hockey team, which is incredible. They got a silver medal in 2024 at the Deaf World Hockey Championship, but she got to coach behind the bench for the Stanley Cup champion Florida Panthers this past preseason as part of that NHL coaching development program. And so to have her make the jump into the PWHL is like a logical next step for her.
100%. Yeah, I think it's fantastic. What can we say about their other assistant coach that they also named, coming from also some WHL experience, and has been a skills coach before also?
Yeah, I think Clayton Beddoes, I'm guessing he's going to be special teams / skills oriented. I can't say that for sure until we see how it plays out in their training camp. But just based on his coaching experience, I know like Red Deer has not been a good team the last couple of years, just because I know the Philadelphia Flyers have drafted a couple players from them. So I've kind of dug into what they've done the last couple of years for that reason. But I do think that if there's a specialty role here for him that makes sense, I get it. And, we'll see how this coaching group in Seattle plays out, because I think, it's a challenging group with a lot of experience.
Right.
And so they're going to expect the expertise at the highest level when they're getting coached on the ins and outs of what they're supposed to be doing out there.
Indeed. And just to circle back to Christine here, as I was reading this announcement, it made me think of something I reported on in the WNBA, where the WNBA, as a way of getting more former players on the coaching track, they started giving teams that had a former player on their roster, on their coaching staff, an additional coach slot. So instead of just the 2 assistants to have 3 total coaches, they would add an additional assistant. For example, the New York Liberty, Sandy Brondello is the head coach. She played in the WNBA. So by way of her being a former player, it doesn't have to be the head coach. It can be any of the coaches in the first 3 chairs. Then they can add an additional coach to their staff. So I think that is something that I'm going to keep an eye on, and maybe that we talk to the PWHL about. I've talked about that with regard to some of the programs that they have for officiating. And one of the things that we heard from Jana Heffert is by working with officials in the off season and having some of the boot camps, so to speak, that they have, it's a way to onboard perhaps players after they retire from their hockey careers to keep in the game. I think another way to do that is for pathways in coaching. So curious to see what happens there. But Rachel, that will be our show. Again, we will go Seattle, then Vancouver in the coming couple of weeks as we close out our.
Maybe they'll have team names when we talk about them. Who knows?
Maybe, or maybe their inaugural schedule. Maybe they'll have that.
A girl can dream.
A girl can dream when their preseason will start, because September's right around the corner, babes. We got to get going. Yep. We got to get going here. But either way, when we have the news, we will share it here on the Women's Hockey Report. For Rachel Donner, Erica L Ayala, make sure to please like, comment on these videos, subscribe to the Locked On NHL channel. But if you want a curated list of clips from this show and information coming from women's hockey, including me having a clip of the First Nations team here at the Amerigo Latam Cup, and they burn sage before every game, Rachel. It makes the rink smell good. And we know how
Love
hockey
that.
equipment can smell. But on a more serious note, a part of their culture. So that was beautiful. We share all of that on our TikTok channel. So join us at women's_hockey_report. And that's where you can find more information on the wide world of women's hockey. But that will be all for our Saturday show. We appreciate you joining us every Saturday, and we will catch you next week for our deep dive into a new team. Well, as deep of a dive as you can go into a team that hasn't played any games yet, the PWHL Seattle squad. And then after that, Vancouver. Thanks as always for tuning in. We'll catch you next week.